By the autumn of 1944, the German state was running on paper. Orders were issued to units that no longer existed. Retreat was called redeployment. Defeat was called strategic repositioning. And the women who had been pressed into service to keep the machinery running, the clerks, the telephone operators, the postal workers, the anti-aircraft auxiliaries who tracked Allied bombers across burning skies, found themselves moving westward with formations that were dissolving around them as they walked. For many of them, surrender was not a decision. It was simply what happened when the last officer disappeared and there was no one left to tell them what to do next. They stood at the edges of American lines in small groups, sometimes alone, sometimes in clusters of 30 or 40, holding whatever they had managed to carry, which was rarely much. The Americans did not know what to do with them either. Not immediately, not with any confidence. The planning documents had addressed male prisoners. They had addressed wounded soldiers, civilian internees, surrendered officers. The female auxiliary was a category that existed at the margins of the paperwork, acknowledged but not fully anticipated at the scale it was now arriving. Processing teams worked under pressure that did not allow for hesitation. Names were recorded, unit affiliations were noted where they could be determined. The women were separated from male prisoners and moved into whatever space was available. In the fall and early winter of 1944, that space was rarely adequate. One group, documented in US Army military government reports and later in post-war testimony collected by historians of captivity, arrived at a temporary holding facility in northeastern France in November. The facility had been a secondary school before the war, and briefly a German administrative office during the occupation. Now it was a processing point for prisoners moving westward faster than the system could absorb them. The women were placed in what had been a gymnasium. The floor was wood, worn smooth by years of use. The high windows were intact but unheated, and the glass had the particular quality of glass in cold rooms, slightly fogged along the lower edges, cold to the touch even from a metre away. There were no chairs, there were no benches at that point. The women sat on the floor and waited. They had been sitting on the floor or the ground for most of the past 2 weeks. This was not materially different. What was different was the not knowing what the process was, not knowing what would happen when it ended, not knowing whether the silence around them was a good sign or a bad one. The American guards rotated at intervals. They were young, most of them, infantry replacements and rear area troops pulled from units that needed their forward soldiers elsewhere. They walked the perimeter of the room at regular intervals and otherwise stood near the doors. They did not speak to the prisoners unless addressing a specific question of movement or procedure. Their German was limited, in most cases, to a small set of commands. The women had been told, in the months and years before this moment, that American soldiers were many things, none of them good. The picture was consistent across official channels and unofficial conversations both, undisciplined, vindictive, capable of cruelties that military convention would not restrain because the Americans, it was implied, did not truly understand military convention. These women had absorbed this, the way people absorb anything they are told repeatedly, by sources they have no means to verify, not as certainty necessarily, but as the operating assumption, the framework through which they read whatever happened next. Nothing that happened in the gymnasium in those first hours confirmed it, but nothing definitively disproved it either. Fear does not dissolve quickly. It waits for evidence. On the second day, a practical problem surfaced that had been building since before the surrender, but had reached a point where it could no longer be managed quietly. Several of the women were ill. Not severely, not in ways that required immediate medical intervention, but ill in the accumulating way that comes from 2 weeks of movement in cold weather, with inadequate food and no consistent shelter. Coughs that had started as minor irritations had deepened. Headaches were constant. One woman had developed a fever that left her alternately hot and shivering, sitting with her back against the gymnasium wall and her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though she could hold the heat inside by force. The others watched her without saying much. There was nothing to say that was not obvious. What was not obvious was whether saying anything about it to the Americans would help or make things worse. This was the calculation that ran beneath everything in those first days. The calculation was not simple. In the system these women had come from, drawing attention to weakness was rarely safe. Weakness created liability. Liability created consequences. The German military structure was not indifferent to the suffering of its personnel, out of malice in every case, but it was indifferent systematically, as a matter of design, because efficiency required that individual discomfort, not slow collective function. You bore what you bore. You did not present it as a problem to be solved by someone above you in the structure, Concard. You solved it yourself, or you endured it. One woman broke this habit of mind before the others. She had been a telephone exchange operator attached to a Luftwaffe administrative unit in Belgium. She was 22 years old. She had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 4 days. She stood up from the gymnasium floor, walked to the nearest guard, and spoke to him in German. She told him that one of the women had a fever and had been feverish since the previous afternoon, and that it was getting worse. She spoke clearly and without embellishment. She was not asking for anything specific. She was stating a fact, the way you state a fact when you have decided that the consequences of stating it cannot be worse than the consequences of not stating it. The guard was a corporal from Minnesota. He was 20 years old. His German consisted of Halt, Raus, Ausweis, and a handful of other commands, none of which were relevant to what she was saying. He did not understand the words, but he understood that she was standing in front of him, addressing him directly, which required something in response, and he understood from her posture and the direction of her eyes that she was pointing him towards something rather than making a demand of him. He followed her eyes to the woman against the wall. He looked at her for a moment. He could see the flush across her cheekbones and the particular stillness of someone whose body is spending all of its available energy on something internal. He had seen men look like that. He knew what it meant. He said nothing to the telephone operator. He walked to the door of the gymnasium, spoke briefly to another guard, and left. The women watched him go. The telephone operator returned to her place on the floor. She did not know what she had set in motion, if anything. She told the woman next to her what she had done. The other woman said only that she hoped it had not been a mistake. They waited. 40 minutes passed, perhaps 50. The gymnasium was quiet, except for the occasional sound of movement near the doors, and the coughing that had become a constant texture of the room. Then the door opened and the corporal returned. He had not come alone. Behind him was a man in a different uniform, an olive drab uniform, with a caduceus on the collar, a medical officer, carrying a canvas bag that clinked faintly as he walked. He crossed the gymnasium floor without hesitation, crouched down in front of the feverish woman, and opened his bag. He did not speak German. He did not need to. The examination was brief and methodical. He checked her temperature, her pulse, her eyes. He pressed 2 fingers gently against the glands along her jaw. He opened his bag again and produced a small paper envelope, aspirin, 2 tablets and a canteen of water. He placed them in her hands. He held up 2 fingers, then pointed at the tablets, then mimed swallowing. He nodded. She swallowed them. He closed his bag. He stood up. He looked at the other women in the room for a moment, a professional assessment, the kind that takes in a group and calculates quickly. He said something in English to the corporal that none of the women understood. Then he left. The corporal remained. He looked at the telephone operator who had come to find him. He did not say anything. He held her gaze for a moment in a way that was not threatening, not warm, not anything she had a precise name for, before he looked away and resumed his position near the door. The women said nothing for a long time after that. The feverish woman held the empty paper envelope in her hand and looked at it as though she were trying to determine what it meant. Not medically, she understood aspirin. What she was trying to determine was what the sequence of events that had just occurred meant about the situation she was in. She had stated a problem. No punishment had followed. Someone had left and come back with a solution. The solution had been applied without comment and without conditions. This was so different from what she had been prepared for that it did not immediately register as kindness. It registered first as an anomaly, an event that did not fit the framework. She told a researcher in 1981, in an interview conducted for a study of female prisoner experience in the Western European theatre, that she had spent the rest of that afternoon trying to find the explanation for it that fit what she knew. The explanation that required the least revision of what she had been told about Americans. She could not find one. In the days that followed, the medical officer returned twice more. He moved through the gymnasium room by room, which by then had expanded to include adjacent classrooms, as more prisoners arrived, and he treated what he found. Blisters from long marches were cleaned and wrapped. A respiratory infection was identified and addressed with sulfur tablets from the army supply. Frostbitten fingers were treated with careful rewarming and clean bandaging. None of it was accompanied by commentary. It was simply done in the way that practical things are done when the person doing them has accepted that they are his responsibility. American military medical doctrine in the fall and winter of 1944 was clear on the matter of prisoner treatment. The Geneva Convention required it. US Army training reinforced it. Officers who failed to provide adequate medical attention to prisoners were accountable, and accountability in the US Army of that period was not theoretical. It was inspections, reports, investigations. The culture this created was imperfect. No system operating under the pressure of a collapsing front in a European winter is capable of perfection, but the culture was real. The women experienced it as a series of small, specific events that accumulated into something they had not expected to feel inside a prisoner compound. The growing sense that their suffering had weight. That when they experienced a problem, the problem was not invisible to the people responsible for them. That the telephone operator who had stood up from the gymnasium floor and walked to a guard who did not speak her language had not made a mistake. Other women began doing the same thing, cautiously at first, then with slightly less caution as the pattern became clear. A woman with a badly infected cut on her palm, a woman whose boots had caused open wounds on both heels, a woman who had not eaten in ways that sustained her for long enough that standing at morning count had become genuinely difficult. Each time, something happened, not always immediately, not always with the speed the situation might have demanded. The system was strained and the supplies were not always there. But the response came, the problem was addressed. Nobody performed generosity for them. There were no speeches. No American officer gathered them and explained that this was the difference between democracy and fascism, between the Allies and the Reich. Nothing was framed, nothing was explained. Things simply happened or did not happen, and over time the pattern of what happened accumulated into something that could not be attributed to coincidence. The telephone operator from Belgium would later say that the hardest part of processing what she experienced in that gymnasium and in the weeks that followed was not the events themselves. The hardest part was unlearning the assumption that had governed every relationship with authority she had known since she was old enough to be aware of authority. The assumption that the people responsible for her were indifferent to her suffering as a matter of course, and that drawing attention to it was more likely to produce additional suffering than to reduce it. That assumption did not disappear quickly. It had been built over years and it could not be dismantled in days. But it developed, as she described it, a crack. Something had happened that the assumption could not account for. A corporal from Minnesota who did not speak German had looked at a sick woman sitting against the gymnasium wall and had gone to find someone who could help. Nobody had told him to. Nobody had instructed him to pay particular attention to the German female prisoners in his charge. He had simply looked, seen what was in front of him, and done something about it. Years later, when the war was long over, and Germany had rebuilt itself into something unrecognizable from what these women had served, a small number of them spoke about their times as prisoners in ways that went beyond the facts of captivity. They spoke about the recalibration, the slow, uncomfortable process of understanding that the world did not operate by the rules they had been taught. That authority was not always terror, that an enemy was not always a monster, but that a man who did not share your language and had every institutional reason to treat you as a problem to be managed could look at a woman shivering against a wall and feel something that caused him to act. These were not the stories they expected to carry out of the war. They had expected, if they survived, to carry stories of endurance, of suffering borne without complaint, because complaint was useless. What they carried instead was something more complicated and harder to explain to people who had not been there. The memory of a paper envelope placed in a pair of trembling hands, a medical bag opened on a gymnasium floor, the corporal who went to find someone who could help and came back. Sometimes that is what the war left behind, not the battles, not the retreats, not the architecture of collapse, but a moment in a cold room when something expected did not happen and something unexpected did, and a person who had been prepared for the worst found herself holding aspirin and trying to understand what it meant. If this story is worth remembering, consider subscribing so these moments are not lost. Like the video to help it reach more people, and leave a comment below wherever you are watching from.